Okay, good morning, everybody. This is Eitan Ben Avram for Aleph Male here in the Holy Land of Israel, and you are watching / listening to the Aleph Male Podcast. And I am here with Jake Freeman, otherwise known as
the Modern Mystic.
The Modern Mystic. I have been vibing with Jake on Instagram for a while now. And yesterday, Jake was posting about the concept. I saw Jake posted yesterday about basically how he went to an ancient Jewish Torah sanctuary, right? Is that a way of saying it?
I would say it's so in English, some people call it the Jewish catacombs.
Jewish catacombs.
But it's basically a refugee city after the destruction of the temple that
it was so you mean like a city of refuge, like a biblical city of refuge?
Yes, exactly.
Like one of the 4 cities of refuge.
I'm not sure if it's one of the 4 cities. It may be. It's definitely
okay.
A 1st and 2nd century city.
Okay. And so basically, we might need to do some fact checking on what exactly it was, but basically it was an ancient Jewish site. And one of the things that Jake mentioned was he thought it was interesting that the writing from the site was not in Hebrew, but in Greek, because that was the culture of the time in the 1st and 2nd century, that even though it was a Jewish site, the writing on the site was in Greek. And then that led to a thread of just the concept of Jewish identity and Jewish culture, and the idea that there's an exilic Jewish culture. There's an aspect of Jewish culture which is a reflection of being in exile, as well as an aspect of Jewish culture which you could say is authentic to being Jewish. And included in that is language, and the language that we use, which is very interesting because that goes all the way back to the Torah. Talks about how one of the things that allowed the Jews to stay Jewish when they were slaves in Egypt was their language, that they maintained their language. And also that includes how we refer to ourselves, which is sort of how this conversation got going, because something that I've noticed recently, really in that I think maybe the past 4 or 5 years, I would say, is people starting to refer to themselves as Judeans rather than Jews. So what's up with that, Jake? Because this is basically where we're jumping on to our conversation. What's up with that?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things going on, and like kind of with any term that starts on the internet or gets popular starting on the internet, different people mean different things. So I think I'm going to speak specifically for what I mean, and then we can talk a little bit about how the term is being used, maybe more generally, in different spaces online. So I mean specifically that to use the term in a way to describe ourselves as Jewish people, or people descended from people of the land of Israel, Judeans, ancient Judeans.
Now, why aren't you using the term Israelites?
So I think that's an even more interesting question. I think part of it is because in some ways, Israelites, depending on exactly what you mean, can reference the specific nation of the Israelites. Historically, when there was like the 2/3 kingdoms period. So the Judeans, or the nation of Judah, was in the south, and the nation of the Israelites was in the north. And so
you're talking about like historical semantics that are nonetheless important, because they were all Jews.
Exactly. And then I think it gets even more complicated when we use Israelites, because of the way kind of history has happened and the split, and where there are people today who claim to be descended of the Israelites, but are not necessarily Jews. And they'll usually use some terminology like part of the house of Israel, or the house of the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think
we have Israelites, we have Jews, Israelites, and Judeans.
That's correct.
Okay. And so I interrupted you. So just keep going with your flow of Judean.
No problem. So I think it's I use the term Judean specifically as a reference to most people that we call Jewish today are very likely descended from the peoples of the southern kingdom of Judah.
Okay, so just to reflect, you're talking about how there was a historical split, and what we refer to as the Israelites, or the reason why you don't use the term Israelites is because actually there was a diaspora. There was this is like when we refer to, another way of saying Israelites could be the lost tribes, that there were these tribes that got kicked out into the lands. But the tribe of Judah, i.e. the Judeans, still remained in the land, and that's where we as the Jewish people draw our lineage from. And so that's why you use the term Judean.
That's correct.
And let me ask you a question now. Why not just refer to yourself as a Jew? Why go that extra step and refer to yourself as a Judean? What's the diuk? What's the distinction that's being that's important to you, that you want to turn the gem so that facet is the one that's shining?
Sure. So I think there's two historical reasons that are important to me. And so one is that in English, over the past couple of hundred years, the term for our people has changed over time, depending on, it seems to me to be kind of if it's used as a slur or not. So previously we were called Hebrews in English, and my understanding is that then Hebrew became a kind of a slur for a while. And so we switched to Jewish to not be, the term for us to not become just a slur. Rather than
the term Jewish, right?
Right.
It's so interesting. The term Jewish is really just like the anglicized version of Yehuda, right?
Exactly.
Which is just Judah, which is just like Judean. It's just like another interesting. Okay,
exactly. But the common thread in those usually is that the term is coming from the outside. It's what people who aren't Jews or Judeans refer to us as. And I think in our case specifically, it's important for us to be the ones coming up with the term.
It's interesting because I'm just asking myself, by the way, this is a Jewish conversation, so I'm going to feel free to interrupt you, and you feel free to interrupt me. Okay.
Sure. It's part of the culture.
I have to tell you on that note, I didn't realize growing up in a Jewish house that interruption in certain social skills and certain social norms is actually considered rude, because the way I understood it is that if someone doesn't interrupt me, that means they're not listening. Right? It's why aren't you interrupting me? Why are you just letting me talk? That either means that you're not interested or you agree with everything I say. And the chances of that being true are zero. So why aren't you interrupting me? And then in non-Jewish cultures, it's rude to cut someone off midstream. But this is a Jewish podcast, so feel free to interrupt me. I'm going to interrupt you. And on that note, it's interesting to note that in terms of the term Jewish and Judean and being an outside term versus something that we refer to ourselves, one of the things that's curious to me is, well, how did the Jews in the times of the Talmud, the Jews in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, the Jews before the Beit HaMikdash, how did they refer to themselves? Do you have any thoughts about that?
based on my understanding, they would have called themselves like people of Yehuda, like they would have identified
Really?
with the tribe. I think so.
I figured, but I'm not just talking about. Okay, so when you say Jews, you're talking about Yehudi, like people from the tribe of Judah, but I'm talking about like
Right.
all 12 tribes.
Oh,
Like
that's a really good question. I think it probably would have been
Israel,
something
right?
Israel, like something like the House of Israel, like
Yeah,
we
it would
hear
probably
people
been
use
Israel
today.
or the House of
Yeah,
Israel. See, I really like that. I really like
yeah.
the idea, but at the same time, it doesn't feel authentic to me to call myself an Israelite because the term is so like far back in the past that it's like
Hmm.
shrouded in the mists of time slash mythology.
Hmm.
And so like I wouldn't, I'm just like thinking like, okay, well, do I want to use the term Judean? Does that feel authentic to me? Like, but what about unity? What about like the idea it was all
Hmm.
12 tribes, you know? And so then, okay, so then I can be an Israelite. But then when I think of Israelite, I think of the dudes who I used to pass in Times Square holding big poles dressed in like leather armor who referred to themselves as like the true Israelites. And I'm like, okay, so I don't know if that's really, I think being Jewish is just easier than jumping into that swamp of what do we mean when we say Israelite, because also like I associate Israelite with like the movie The Ten Commandments and these like people who left Egypt who like
Hmm.
were the ancient Israelites, and it's like, okay, so I see myself as descended from the ancient Israelites.
Right.
um
So I think this is probably coming from that based on a lot of the media that we get, kind of especially from as English speakers. I'm kind of assuming English is your first language, but
yeah, I
I could
grew
be
up in New
wrong.
Jersey.
Okay.
Where'd you
um
grow up?
North Carolina,
Okay, cool.
which is a whole interesting story for another time. But
Like how did a Jewish boy from North Carolina end up in Israel?
so I'm visiting for now.
Oh,
uh
okay.
Bezrat Hashem, Aliyah will be the next step, but
Where do you
we
live?
gotta
Where are you
test
living?
the waters first. Sorry.
Where are you living?
uh as far as visiting here,
Yeah, yeah,
or
yeah. Oh, you don't,
so
you're like couch surfing, you're traveling?
yeah, Airbnb. So we did some time in Eilat down in the south, and then Sfat up in the
So you're
north, and
saying that I
Valona.
happened to catch you while you're here.
Yeah, this is completely like kismet, just like kind of luck.
Ah, okay. Because I've been following you for a while
Oh, awesome! Thank you.
on Instagram.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've been following you for a while. So like at least like 6 months or something like that.
Okay. Yeah, you
So,
just happened to catch me. Just happened to catch me in Israel.
okay. Got it. All right. Awesome. So how's it going? How's being here?
Oh, it's my probably my not probably it's my favorite place to be. Um, it's awesome, and it's always like it's always got its ups and its downs. Like I'm just getting over a cold. Um, but I love being here. Like the Eilat was beautiful, and I got to do some scuba diving and see the Red Sea, which was amazing.
Mm.
And then we drove up to Sfat, and I always love being in the mystical city.
So you've
And
been here before.
oh yes, last time I was here was August.
Okay. All right. Recently, did you grow up like from?
No, no, I had a kind of an interesting upbringing because my parents are more secular, um, but they feel that it's really important. And when I was growing up, they felt it was really important for me. I've got to know the Jewish stuff. I don't have
Mhm.
to follow all the practices if I don't want to. That's kind of my choice. But I've got to know it. And so I
Interesting.
had this kind of in the middle upbringing where I wasn't from, but I also wasn't kind of secular, and I didn't
Mhm.
really fit into reform.
You
And
were Jewishly informed.
yeah, that's a good way to put it. But being in North Carolina, I wasn't really close to any other Jewish communities, so I was very much homeschooled in my Jewish education. Um,
Okay.
so there's some things that I'm like way more knowledgeable about, just because that's what my dad was interested in, and there's some things that I still I'm not missing, but I'm not as informed as I could be, that other people who went through kind of a
I'm still
mainstream education.
far from informed in terms of what it means to be informed. There's so much to learn.
Oh, of course. So I think your question was about the houses of Israel and where do we fit?
Yeah.
And so I think because that's been exoticized to some extent, especially in the Western world, I think we've lost our reference for like what does that mean to us. It's also been a couple thousand years, so a long time. And I think when I try and think about like where do I fit as far as kind of the house of Israel level, I view it as kind of like your first you have a reference to who you are as part of your family, and then your town, and then your your state or your country. And I think we often reference ourselves in the first maybe 2 or 3, and that goes up to Jewish as like a nationhood or a peoplehood. And I think that when we talk about the house of Israel, that's just the next step up as far as like in the way that the US has states. They're being a Judean is one half or part like one of the state constituents of the house of Israel. So it's one of the tribal constituents there. And so we are part of the house of Israel, but I think most people just identify at that slightly lower, that next rung down is all that it is.
So just to reflect, you're saying that we are all of the house of Israel, i.e. the Jewish people are from the house of Israel. But when we use the term Jewish, we are referring to the fact that we're Judeans or from the tribe of Yehuda.
Exactly.
It's so interesting. So that means that I grew up like very, very secular. I grew up very assimilated. I grew up like eating bacon, egg, and cheese on a bagel. And if you asked me if I was Jewish, I would have been like, well, I'm culturally Jewish, but I'm not really Jewish. And I really had no clue what it meant to be a Jew until I came to Israel when I was 20 years old. And I basically had a calling from God, and at the same time was awoken. I wasn't woke because that term didn't exist, but I was awakened to my heritage. It was like discovering I was from Atlantis, or like discovering I was like a wizard. Because like before that, I was white. I was just like white. It's like, what are you? Like, oh, I'm white. I go to the mall. Yeah, like Europeans where I came from, like really rammed some other people pretty badly, which is, and like I had no clue that actually I was the rammed. I had no clue that like I was like I was actually descended from the people who lived in the first ghetto, who were all herded into a neighborhood. In this case, it was in Vienna.
Yeah.
The term ghetto comes from the Italian word foundry.
Yeah, and there's an island in Venice literally called Ghetto.
Oh yeah, sorry, Venice, not Vienna, Venice. Yeah. And called ghetto, right? Yeah, so it's like I'm not white, I'm Jewish. And not only am I Jewish, like I have my own spiritual lineage, because also growing up highly assimilated, I was like, yeah, I was very into Buddhism, very into like just sort of like the Eastern meditation, mystical paths. I had a very strong renunciate streak. I also saw like in your Instagram path that you talk about Kabbalah, and I want to sort of also dip into that of like, what do we mean when we say the word Kabbalah, and what does it mean to be a Kabbalist? Because in the same way that there's a person who can be a rabbi, which could mean that they're equivalent of a Jewish lawyer, meaning like they've like mastered a certain body of law, like intellectually, versus like the concept of a rabbi or a rebbe as like a spiritual teacher / leader / exemplar. Another understanding of what we mean when we say the word rabbi. So too, in the term Kabbalist, a Kabbalist could simply mean somebody who has studied Kabbalah, right? Or a Kabbalist could mean something entirely different. And what does that mean? And actually, that's part of the tie-in to Aleph Male, because really, my understanding of what I mean when I use the word Aleph Male is actually very much connected to Kabbalah in what I believe is the true sense of the word of what it means to be a Kabbalist, which is to align your will with Hashem's will in real time. Not, yeah.
That's definitely a definition you can use. I like it.
Yeah. Yeah. But what we were still parsing out the names. But so I want to just pass the ball back to you. But so you grew up informed, but your parents wanted to give you options in terms of observance. And then how did you discover Judaism as a spiritual path?
So growing up in the South, and just for if there's Jews who are thinking of moving to the South, it has changed a ton in the past 20 years. So what I'm going to talk about now does not reference what it is like today. But growing up in kind of the rural American South, outside of, like, far enough away from Raleigh that there wasn't really a Jewish community, it was made very clear to me that I did not go in the white category. And sometimes it would, if I didn't act too Jewishly or I didn't say anything, I would go in that category for a little bit. But the second people found out, or I referenced it, or I did some faux pas that, like, a white person would immediately know that you wouldn't do that. And people would go, "Oh, that was weird," like, and I would go, "Oh, I'm Jewish," immediately no longer in the white category. But I also had this interesting experience where I didn't really go in the brown or black categories either. And so I kind of had my own category.
You're a Jew boy.
Yeah, exactly. And so just based on where I grew up, I can code switch kind of both ways, depending on who's around, and that throws people off sometimes. But I had this really interesting experience, I think, where I was very Jewish. But after my bar mitzvah at 13, I kind of went the secular path for a couple of years. And so I didn't really participate in Jewish life, didn't do any Jewish stuff. I ate bacon. I had McDonald's. I didn't keep strict kosher or anything like that. And then I went to college because I was going to live the army life. And Baruch Hashem, that didn't work out.
I mean, you wanted to join the army?
Yeah, I was going to join the U.S. Army. But it wasn't really a good path for me. I think I was trying to prove to myself that I was more American than I really am. And so I think,
by the way, I just want to say, God bless America.
Yeah, and this isn't.
I just wanted to say that because, like, within the cultural milieu of, let's just call it, spiritual people / people who might be watching this podcast, there's a lot of criticism of the United States, and the United States definitely has that which it can be criticized about in very deep ways. And at the same time, God bless America. I love America. I just need to say that.
Yeah.
Because there's so much hate on America, and it's like, I think it's just so missing the point.
And like you said, some of it is deserved, and some of it just goes over the top.
Tremendous criticism deserving. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that you go all the way to just, like, becoming a self-hating American or just hating America. It's just like, no.
Right. And it's not a dig that I'm just not as American as I wanted to be.
Like, I hear that. No, I totally hear that. I wasn't aiming that towards you. I was just.
Oh, no, you're good. You're good. I understand. No, not offended. Don't worry. And so
I didn't join the U.S. Army either, and I made Aliyah. So, like,
Yeah. I know you get it, and you probably get it more than many people.
And I wouldn't want to live in America, actually.
Yeah. It's it's an interesting place to live. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And so basically I went through this kind of process of realizing that I'm not as American as I wanted to be. And I was doing the army thing, not because I really wanted to do it in the Corps, which is why you should do it if that's the path that you take, but because I wanted to prove something. And that's not necessarily really a good reason to commit your life
Probably just ended up as cannon fodder.
Who knows? And so I kind of went on this journey to like, all right, I'm not this person that I really wanted to be. So who am I now? And I got this opportunity to go study abroad in Germany. And, I kind of knew like, okay, my grandparents' generation was, destroyed in the Holocaust, and my grandfather and a couple of others are basically the only ones that made it out, and I had some relationship with that, but I didn't really know what that meant until I went to Germany, and just kind of by happenstance I took like a World War II history class, and this was a big part of it, and so we visited some of those places, and I get to experience like, oh, like what does this really mean in some sense. And then I took it upon myself when I went and visited Auschwitz, which was like an indescribable experience. Like I try and tell people and I try and warn people before they go visit that like you're going to cry and that is okay. And it's really the only way to kind of deal with the emotions while you're there that I know of. And so that kind of was a waypoint on my path, and it kind of like I get to kind of have this deeper connection with my ancestors and like what does this mean and what happened, and then I got kind of interested like, okay, was this like a single point in time that things happened? And then I got to do some historical research, and it's like, no, there was a build up to this throughout European history. And then Baruch Hashem, I got to do another study abroad the next semester in China. And I was shocked at how many other Jewish students there were, because there were pretty much, I'd met almost no Jewish students. There'd been a couple or like openly Jewish students while I'd been at school and all that kind of stuff. So I get to kind of experience being around other Jews in a major way for the first time in my life. And it was wonderful, right? And most of them were secular, but it was still having this like cultural affinity that I really only ever had in the home that I now have with other people. And that was cool. And then one of my friends took me into a Chabad. And I'm not a Chabadnik, but I have a lot of respect. And I really appreciate all the outreach and work that they do. I'm currently, we have our local Chabad in Raleigh that's amazing with Rabbi Zalmi Dubinsky, and he and Mushka, his Rebbitzin, put in a ton of work to build a really beautiful community. So I want to give them a kind of a shout out here. And so that was kind of like my first experience with like organized Jewish life. Was I went to a couple of Chabad gatherings in Shanghai, and then came home and kind of put it down, didn't really do anything with it. And then, very long story short, I spent some time in Europe after I got married, and then we came back. Oh, thank you. And that one probably deserves 30 minutes on its own, because it's a crazy, wonderful story. But we came back from Europe basically because of COVID. And then we were looking for a Jewish community. We were going to try and join organized Jewish life, and we ran into this Chabad, and it's kind of been our home, our spiritual home ever since for now in Raleigh. And so that's kind of the journey that's led me here. And then I got interested in mysticism more generally, and Zalmi's been really supportive of that. He prefers the Hasidic way, which definitely has its merits and its wonderful things, but I also really like getting direct to the texts of the Kabbalists a little bit more. So, and then I think you wanted to talk about Kabbalah and like what does that mean for Jews today, and like who's a Kabbalist and who's not, and like what does that all mean? Like, do you have any specific questions, or do you just want me to riff?
Yeah, I think I'm curious about what was like your gateway. What was your gateway into the realm of Kabbalah?
Sure. So like I mentioned before, I have an affinity with Chabad, and kind of through Chabad, I have an affinity with the Hasidic movement. And I think really historically, one of the really big innovations of the Hasidic movement is Jewish mysticism, or Kabbalah, used to be very much a closed practice, even to other Jews. So it was something that was only taught to the
It was
best
like an
students.
elite. It was an elite branch of information.
Yes, very much so. And to give the Kabbalists credit, like with good reason, right? Because historically it has been both an amazing thing and brought a lot to spiritual life and Judaism overall, but it's also been it can and has been used for negative things.
I can tell you from personal experience. There's an injunction that you shouldn't start learning Kabbalah till you're 40. And I have an idea that there's certain like different branches of information have different frequencies.
Yes.
So for instance, if you're studying the menu at McDonald's, like it's not going to have the same level of internal impact as, say, reading Harry Potter. And reading Harry Potter is not going to have the same level of impact as, say, studying the Holocaust.
Right.
And studying the Holocaust is not going to have the same level of impact as, say, I don't know, reading some sort of transformative text with like a therapist or a spiritual guide, like say studying the Tanya. Right. So different branches of information have like affect one's internal world in a different way. And I used to live in Boulder, Colorado, and there was a woman there who, there was definitely some weird thing going on where basically I randomly ran into her every day, almost, for a while.
Wow.
It was always like I'd run into her in a store, or I'd run into her on the street, or I'd run into her. It wasn't like because we went to the same place all the time. It was like around town, and we became friends. Her father was Jewish. Her mother wasn't Jewish. Right? We really vibed. So, but at the same time, I wasn't going to like do anything because she wasn't Jewish, but we were friends. At that point in my life, I was friends with women, and she started going deep into Kabbalistic texts, really, really deep. And she started keeping a journal in which she was like writing all these things. And then she slowly started having these like crazy mystical experiences in which she was like seeing forces and entities. And eventually she lost her mind and declared herself the Messiah in the middle of our shul. Right. And I was like,
it's not healthy.
Don't study Kabbalah until you're 40. Don't study Kabbalah, until like you're grounded, until you're rooted, because again, information has frequencies. And those, it's like, what's the voltage that you're tapping into when you're studying certain information? And depending on how deep you go into Kabbalah, and depending on the context, in this case, she was very isolated, and it was just her by herself.
Yeah, that's not a good way. That's not how you want
to. So anyway, I just throwing that out there in terms of adding more context to just understanding what we mean when we say the word Kabbalah. It's like not like studying, the
runes or whatever. Because you're right to point that out, I think for two reasons. One, if you Google Kabbalah or you look it up on Instagram, you're going to get a wide variety of things that may or may not have anything to do with Jewish mysticism, and it's connected Kabbalah, or like revealed knowledge in English, maybe.
And actually, on that note, like, I just want to say that, like, when you say Jewish mysticism or its connection to Judaism, like Kabbalah as it's understood within Judaism, is that really Kabbalah is not supposed to be studied or practiced outside of a halachic context. That, like, the idea. Sorry, go ahead. Go.
No. You're. It is really important to put these guardrails out, and I appreciate that you're doing that.
Yeah. So that just because on that note, you're absolutely right, especially living in like the 22nd century,
Yeah.
It's like we're in a place where like the 21st century. Are we the 21st or 22nd? I always thought of us as being in the 21st century before 2000.
I think it's the 21st, but there's a weird way that they count. It doesn't start at 0.
Okay, because I was gonna say, because I remember being in like the 21st century in 1990. So like I was like, okay, anyway, let's just forget that. Wow, now I think maybe I've been studying too much Kabbalah. Okay. So I'm traveling in time. I'm actually speaking to you backwards. No, but I think so. Okay. But so yeah, just that Kabbalah is meant to be studied within a halakhic context, and anybody who's actually interested in authentic Kabbalah needs to understand that's right on with like putting on tefillin, keeping kosher, keeping Shabbos, tahara mishpacha, 613 mitzvot, Shulchan Aruch. Like Kabbalah is meant, if you really want to understand what Kabbalah is about, it has to be seen within its true context. And because we're living in the 21st century, it's been abstracted, as many things have, which has its both positives and negatives.
That's exactly right. And so I was going to go, if people are interested in kind of getting their toes wet, I think the best and kind of safest way to experience Kabbalah is through the Hasidic lens, because one of the amazing things the Hasidic masters did was they translated Kabbalah into a form that everyday people can integrate into their lives and really live a Kabbalistic life without having to worry as much about the meanings and the details, and they can derive meaning for their lives that way without as much risk of the kind of declaring yourself the Messiah in the middle of shul kind of scenario.
Yeah.
I think that's amazing.
You think it's amazing that path exists, the path of Chassidut.
Yes, and you don't have to go and become a Baal Teshuva and or join kind of a from movement to benefit from that. There are many. I think the Breslover movement and the Chabad movement are kind of happy to help people integrate those pieces into their lives, kind of one at a time, so that you get. It's not all at once. You don't get a big blast. You get to.
Where are you holding in your path? Are you like Shomer Shabbat, Shomer Kashrut, and all those things?
It depends. So I try to keep as much Shomer Shabbat and Shomer Kashrut as I can. In the U.S. and living in a rural place, it's kind of really hard to have a truly kind of Orthodox understanding of kashrut, just because of the way things are. And then I have a medical condition, which I found is actually a genetically Jewish one, where I need way more calories than a kind of a normal person. And so the having a totally vegetarian lifestyle it is not really practical for me. So I do everything I can to kind of keep like a kosher kitchen. But not all of my meat is necessarily like an Orthodox standard level of kosher. But as far as Shomer Shabbat, I try. Sometimes we drive to shul or drive to kind of Chabad events. But
okay, so this is where you're holding in your path.
Yeah, and I want people to know that like it is also okay that Judaism is a journey, and observance for many people is a journey, and that is okay. And I think sometimes that's not talked about enough. So
yeah. Well, no, I mean, I didn't do everything all at once. It was also something that it was a process of taking on more and more of let's just call it Jewish life, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, or mitzvot, or like
Torah and mitzvot. Yeah, but the thing with Torah and mitzvot is taking on more and more mitzvot. Yeah, that's another way of saying it. But so jumping back to the term Kabbalah.
Sure.
Some
so
like,
there's I think we're talking about the path. So I think the easiest path is the Hasidic path. And generally, if you don't feel as grounded in where you are in life and your responsibilities to other people, that's definitely, if you really want to learn and work at it, like that's the path for you. If you're older, it's debated among the sages and Kabbalists whether you really need to be 40.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. I mean, at this point, it's not like.
But the thing they're trying to get at is that you need to be grounded in your relationship to the physical world or material world and other people, and that's going to be the kind of the best guardrail for you if you want to jump into the text.
You know, there's also Jung said the exact same thing. Carl Jung, who's one of my secular spiritual influences.
Yeah.
Although he wasn't secular at all.
No.
That's an interesting term, secular spiritual, non-Jewish spiritual influences. He also writes about the same thing, that because he was essentially pioneering his own inner work journey, there were times where he felt as if he would have lost his mind had he not had his wife and his children and his patience and his practice, because he was going so deep into his inner world that like he might have just completely lost the distinction between his inner world and the outer world, and like what is his own subjective experience versus like his internal versus like actual objective reality.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Well, and Jung is really interesting because he had many Jewish students who, it's my understanding, actually taught him a lot of Kabbalistic concepts.
So I don't know if I have it here,
yeah.
but he has a passage that he wrote. Where is it? I don't know if I have it here, but there's a passage that I actually read at the Kotel. Have you been to the Kotel yet on this visit?
Not on this visit.
You gotta go.
That's gonna be kind of our we're going to Jerusalem last, kind of saving the best, you know.
Okay, cool. You have to go. You have to go. Where are you now?
So we're in Or Akiva, next to Caesarea.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, just as a seeker, which is how I see you, like it's just super important that you connect to the physical places where there's more light.
Yes, very much so.
Because even if you don't even if you don't experience anything, I personally believe that on some level it's like getting into you. The light that's there is going to get into you. Have you been to Meron?
No, I haven't had the chance to.
But you went to Sfat.
But I went to Sfat.
Okay. All right. How long are you here for?
About another week. So it was a 3-week trip overall.
And are you going to have any time to yourself, or is it like with family the whole time?
It's mostly with family. I'm taking a little bit of time to meet some other kind of Instagram friends. Okay. So if I don't know if you're in the area, but if you have time, I'd love to meet.
Yeah, for sure. I actually am not so far from Or Akiva. I'm near Caesarea. I'm about 20 minutes from Caesarea.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll chat offline and
yeah. So in terms of Kabbalah and Chassidut, just like another thing that's emerging for me is this idea that like, so the word Kabbalah means to receive.
Yes.
Right. And within Judaism, there's an idea that when one is living a Jewish life, when one is studying Jewish texts, there's 4 levels of interpretation or reading the text. There's pshat, which is like the surface level meaning of the text. There's remez, which means like you read the text, but it's actually hinting at something else. It's like reading in between the lines. Then there's drash or drush, which is like another layer of reading in between the lines, in which like there's like moral lessons that can be learned, or psychological, spiritual insights that can be learned. And then there's sod, which is like how the text is actually referring to some sort of Kabbalistic underlying structure of information. Like talking about just to give an example, it's like what does it mean when Hashem said, "I will be what I will be"? and how like the name for Hashem is Yud Hey Vav Hey, and the numerical equivalent when you add up Yud Hey Vav and Hey equals the number 26, which is also the same numerical equivalent of the word Aleph, right?
Yes.
Which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is also one, and so from that we learn that like Hashem is one. Like there's these are examples of ways in which we can interpret the texts, and then of course there's sod, and the idea is sod is on the realm of Kabbalah, but I have actually come to my own understanding of what sod means and of what Kabbalah means, which I think is, and what it means to be a Kabbalist, which is separate from perhaps like mainstream ways of thinking about it. In that sod, I don't think sod is a teaching, because really if we understand sod to mean Kabbalah, like sod means secret, nichnas yain yetze sod, like the wine comes in and the secret comes out. So like the sod level of teaching, if I can go and buy it in a book, it's not sod.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Right? Like if I can go and buy a book with something written in it, that's not sod. Like anything that's actually sod is an actual, what I would say is like a non-verbal spiritual transmission. That it's not. Sorry, go ahead. This is where you're supposed to interrupt me. When something comes up for you, interrupt me.
But no, you had my imagination going here. You had me
say it
really deeply about it. I think you make a good point, especially about the process of the kind of secrets or nature of reality being revealed to people, right? And once it's written in a book, in some ways it's more codified, and we can get to the next step of getting closer to the nature of reality, or and you can describe this as getting closer to Hashem, right? And so we're kind of I think you're going in an amazing direction, because in some ways you're talking about like standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, or taking the next building block. Once it's written in a book, okay, that's now codified. That's something we understand and can be communicated in a way that now you and I can take the next step and get to the kind of the next mystery, for lack of a better word. And
get next to really the purpose of studying those texts is because it's a vehicle for that transmission.
Exactly. And that you can build on top of what our sages have done in the past, and really find deep meaning in that, I think is also part of the really important part, and deep meaning in those connections, and that connection with Hashem, but also with other people.
Yeah. And at the same time, obviously, we also have to surrender to the sages. Like there's an element of surrender that needs to happen as well. But nonetheless, like I just want to tell a story. There's a story about how the Baal Shem Tov Makarov, the Maggid of Mezrich, which I think is like an amazing Hasidic story, which is connected to this. So like the Maggid of Mezrich, who was essentially the Baal Shem Tov's, he took up the torch after the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov was the founder of the Hasidic movement. He was the one who taught, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. He was the one who said that, who created this vehicle for connecting to these Kabbalistic concepts without necessarily needing to learn Kabbalah. So when we say Hasidic, anyone who's using the term Hasidic is ultimately sourcing the Baal Shem Tov, right. Rabbi Israel Shem Tov. And so there's a story of how did the Baal Shem Tov, who was like the founder of the Hasidic movement, how did he bring close the Maggid of Mezrich, Rav Dov Ber of Mezrich. So the story goes that Rav Dov Ber was already a Kabbalist in his own right. He was already like a deep Talmud Chacham, a scholar, et cetera, and he wanted to meet the Baal Shem Tov. And there's different versions of this story. But one version is that he went to meet the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov was in a cave, right? And he was studying the Zohar. He was studying a passage from the Zohar, and the Maggid of Mezrich, and he said to the Maggid of Mezrich, like, teach me this passage, learn this passage out for me, which I think is like a very interesting thing in and of itself, where essentially the Baal Shem Tov is saying, like, show me your learning style. It's sort of like Kung Fu, how there's like, there's like the praying mantis Kung Fu, and there's the white lotus Kung Fu, and there's all these different like styles. So it's like the Maggid of Mezrich is coming from like an academy, except instead of a Kung Fu academy, it's like a Torah academy. And he has his Rebbes, which are like his instructors in Torah, so it's like, right. So he's like, learn out this passage from the Zohar for me. Right. And so the Maggid of Mezrich like starts giving over the passage of the Zohar. He's learning it out. And the Baal Shem Tov is sitting there listening. They're sitting over the book listening. And the Maggid of Mezrich is like saying these like super deep, insightful things that are like amazing. Right. And the Baal Shem Tov is like nodding his head, and it's like, good, 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 good. Right. And it's like the passage is talking about angels and an angel of fire and different things. And then finally he finishes explaining the passage, and the Baal Shem Tov is like, okay, very good. He's like, now I'm going to explain the passage. And then the Baal Shem Tov starts talking, and he starts talking about like an angel of fire. And when he says an angel of fire like manifests itself in the room, and when he starts talking about That's light, incredible. It's like light manifests itself in the room, and like the whole room is filled with light. And it was like, instead of just being an intellectual process connecting to the internal world, it was a whole other level, of what we mean when we say to learn out a text, or to learn Kabbalah, or to learn these concepts, that it's not just a concept, that it's a spiritual reality, and that there are people who are walking in the world. And this is why Kabbalah can be so dangerous, because as soon as you step into like they say that like the Talmud warns, it says 4 went into the garden of Pardes, 4 went in to this garden of levels of interpretation, but only 1 came out unscathed, right? Where there's this warning that when you step into this realm, and this is again, I think what Jung was referencing as well, when you step into this realm, you can get lost.
You sure can. And that's why it's so important to have these guardrails, because and like you were just talking about, they're connecting with what we might call like the metaphysical realms, or there's the 4 worlds, and I don't know that we have time to get into exactly what all those mean, because I've got to jump in a minute, but there's a lot of spiritual power there, or if you want to secularize it, you could say metaphysical power. And there are people who can connect to this realm, and in Hasidut, or in Hasidic thought and Kabbalistic thought, that you can actually interact between the metaphysical realm and change the material world, and influence the material world metaphysically. And I think that's part of what is so powerful.
And that's where, for me, like, I have learned from like getting burned in my own way, that like it's just better to do Torah and mitzvot. Like, I've never lost my mind or declared myself the Messiah or been committed or anything like that, but I definitely have become more interested in my own internal reality than my external reality, which you could also call a form of narcissism, whether it's not like vanity. It's nonetheless being so fascinated by the concepts and my own internal journey that I suffered and lost opportunities to connect to my external world. And I think that's actually one of the dangers of any seeker, that any seeker can have, is that because they're on this deeply personal path, they might act, and that can cause a sense of isolation, because what's happening in their internal world might be so disjointed from what's happening outside of them, that it's important to have a community of seekers who are grounded, who you can speak to, rabbis, spiritual mentors, but also to just be aware that and that's also why Judaism is a spiritual path of a community. It's not the spiritual path of an individual.
Right. And it's you can't really do it by yourself. It takes a community.
And on that note, because you're about to bounce, yeah?
Yeah, I've got to run.
Okay, so just on that last note, that's also what the Aleph Male is about. Like the whole concept of the Aleph Male is basically my understanding of what it means to be a Jewish man is a man who walks with Hashem and who walks in all of these worlds and is at the same time grounded in Peshat and is grounded in this world. And that's actually what it means to be an Aleph Male, is to be a B'Tselem Elokim man. To be a man who's truly actualizing the fact that he's made in the image of God. Because it's like, because that is both a masculine and a feminine thing.
Yeah, and it seems to me it's a man who values his relationships, obviously one with Hashem, but also with the other people around them, and values those people. And I think it's in stark contrast with some of the other ideas of a man being much more selfish.
The alpha male, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's an amazing concept. I really support it.
All right, Jake, we have to continue the schmooze.
I'd love to.
Okay, so we'll be in touch.
We'll be in touch. Thank you so much for having me, Atan, and thank you so much to all the listeners. Awesome. I really appreciate it.
People can find you on Instagram, the modern underscore modern underscore mystic.
That's correct.
Right. And obviously you can find me at Aleph Male, ALEPHMALE. And thank you for joining the Aleph Male podcast, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, lehitraot.
Peace. Shalom.
Peace in, peace out, and we'll talk offline.
Definitely.
Okay.
Bye.